You've run a ton of different games, played with a host of different rule sets, you've done different types of storytelling techniques, but what in the world is experimental storytelling? Today we're taking a trip completely off-road from general storytelling techniques and normal adjudicational rules and going into new territory. Now I don't mean flashback sequences or dream sequence games or anything really like that. What we're really talking about today are those types of rules adjudications and setting up games that aren't really ever the norm for a table. Now we've all made house rules and we've all done different rules calls for games that impact our table in different ways. And if you've ever LARPed, you know that especially long-running games need a lot of house rule clarification and a lot of different ways to adjudicate things in the rule set because they're just not really balanced in some cases. In light of all that, today we're going to talk about some different techniques that can help you adjudicate rules in different ways or set up your games in different ways that can keep things fresh at the table. The first thing we're talking about is eschewing rules altogether, no dice, no character sheets, and going pure narrative. Now I know there are some dice-less systems out there and there are different ways to adjudicate games aside from rolling dice or any other sort of complex challenge system. I'm not talking about those games. I'm talking about a regular game that normally has a dice mechanic to it and you completely eradicate it for a game session. This may sound a little odd, but it can be a nice touch to freshen up a game as it gets stale or to keep things moving with a really engaging scene, especially if you're doing a high drama session around the table that may involve challenges, but you don't want to slow up the narrative action or the role playing by stopping, checking stats, rolling dice, and going, okay, I got this, what happens? In this type of game, you're going to basically narrate every single challenge adjudication. Now, this type of technique does require a few things. Mainly, one, you have a table that trusts you as a storyteller and believes you're fair. If you have characters that like to nitpick things and argue, this may not work very well for your table. I mean, it still may be worth a shot, but it's probably going to go over a little awkward with some of those people that don't really trust you as a storyteller, if that makes sense. Second, you should know your players and your characters very well. And the third is something we've talked about time and time again. It's having good table reading skills. Now, I've done this for a tabletop game before, and it went over phenomenal. We were playing Star Wars, things were getting tense. We actually were playing during the Rebellion era, so Vader was still out there, the Empire was still out there, and the Rebels were, still being rebels. So the players had decided to shelter at a Rebel base, and they found out that Vader and the 501st, his Legion, were coming to that base. And for this session, I decided, even though I knew we were going to have a ton of blaster combat, we were going to have a bunch of lightsaber combat, because we had at least one Force sensitive in the party that actually had a lightsaber. And I knew, because one of the players was very high in charisma and bluffing and deception, we were going to have somebody try to con their way out of the situation. Now, normally these types of games would require a lot of dice rolling. My concern was, though, we'd lose a lot of the drama and the high tension of this moment if we sat down rolling out combat for 3 hours as the players fought Vader when they had no chance of winning anyways. So, what I did was I set it up as a cinematic narrative. I would tell the players, here's what's going on, and they would tell me their responses. So, for example, if in combat, say they're in melee and the one person with a lightsaber is swinging through, we'd have Vader wading into the combat, his red saber sizzling and snapping, and it just goes cutting through the air, hissing towards the player. And then you turn and say, what does your character respond with? You call by the character's name, what do you do? Give them a moment to kind of take it in and have them respond, and they'll say maybe like, oh, I throw my lightsaber up to try to deflect, and I throw all my strength into it. My goal is to try to get away from him because I know he's just going to kill me. And so you kind of adjudicate from there. You do a lot of narration, a lot of the details, a lot of thick description, and allow them to stay immersed in the scene. This type of narration technique is really good for keeping immersion. That's the biggest thing. It'll keep people around the table, you'll have them all engaged, but it is important that when you do this adjudication, since it is so easy to just start quashing the things that the players do because the bad guys are just so awesome and powerful, you got to be watching your table. The goal here is not necessarily to make it a good fight or even a fair fight, just to make it an entertaining fight. So as you're watching your players' reactions, you're seeing how they're, acting around the table, the body language, the tone of their voice, and you can kind of keep them going and keep it fun for them. In this circumstance, when this Force sensitive fought Vader, he didn't win, but Vader didn't kill him either. Vader cut a hand off and captured him and threw him to Castle Bass to see if they can torture him into becoming a dark side user. Essentially, that's what was going on. And the player was so engaged with what went down, and when they lost their character's arm, they're like, oh, I'm dead. And then they woke up in Castle Bass later on, they're like, oh no. Now it's a new thing that they get to play through. The player that was conning his way out did beautifully. He's managed to sneak out in an Imperial uniform of an officer. He got caught in the end, but he made his way through the entire battle without a single touch of damage. The blaster fight was a lot of fun because you got to know your characters and how good they are in comparison to like a normal person, or in this case a stormtrooper, so that can be fun to narrate too. Ultimately, this type of experimental storytelling is all about keeping the moment tense, keeping the moment flowing, keeping that energy around the table to have everybody engaged. And it can take what would normally be a session that would probably take several hours. You can condense that cinematic scene into maybe an hour or two and have it be like this awesome like movie experience for the players that they just engaged in. As long as you treat it fairly and your players trust you, you'll have a blast. Now, my second point is one that those who have watched the channel have seen me do, and that's don't tell your players what they're playing. Now, if you've played games that I've run or played with me, you know that I like playing with themes of identity, memory, mystery, and discovery. These, I think, are awesome themes that can be pulled out in just about any game and make it a more enriching experience. But that's just my personal taste. However, if you take that one step further, you can have a game running and not tell your players what it is they're actually playing. And this can provoke some interesting responses. Now, of course, in this type of setting, when you do this at your table, you're obviously going to need your players to trust you. Again, a big thing. You got to have that rapport with your players. You got to have that open communication so you know how they feel about your storytelling, what they like, and what you end up doing is picking a game and not telling them what it is. Now, for certain rule sets, this is easier than others. For example, we ran a Wraith game recently on our Twitch channel where none of the players knew that they were playing Wraith. They didn't know they were dead. They just thought they were playing mortals in the world of darkness. And if you want to, you can catch our video on that. There's actually a playlist on this channel for that as well. But essentially, nobody figured out what they were actually playing, that they were dead until like the last quarter of the game. Right at that back, that back end of the game. That can make an instant response because your players are guessing what's going on. They're not quite sure. And the coolest part about this is the players learn things as their characters learn it. So the reactions you get around the table are raw. They're real. It's not tempered by what they know out of game. For example, if you're playing D&D in a standard setting, in their Faerun, like, oh, it's this drow wielding these two scimitars that just wastes out of the darkness, and alongside him is a Black Panther. People who have played the game or who have read the books know that's Drizzt. It's Drizzt Do'Urden. He's a ranger. And that's Guinevere, his figurine of wondrous power, awesome companion. If they didn't know, and they never played, and you didn't tell them what they were playing, they see that's like, what's going on? Of course, the obvious parts they'll pick up because they know how to game, but up until that point, they're learning things as their characters learn it, and the reactions of their characters at that point are genuine. It makes it an awesome little foil, essentially. Now, running this type of game strategy may force you to change a rule or two to help maintain the mystery. I know when I ran Wraith, I stayed away from calling powers what they actually were and just described them, for example. And I made the way they worked just a little bit off kilter to keep players guessing. So when you're running into powers or spells in the case of D&D or other settings, don't refer to things by their name, describe them. Narrate them. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What changes does it make in the environment? And let them take that in as a player and a character at the same time and make their own conclusion. Now, of course, in games like D&D, you can't really hide the fact that you're playing, well, D&D. I made a D&D character, I have classes, I have abilities, I know the system works this way, and we're obviously playing D&D because I see my character sheet. Now, what you can do in this situation is not let them know what setting you're really going to be playing. So, for example, let's say you're playing Dragonlance, and you have a group of characters, adventurers on Krynn, and for some reason they walk into Shoikan Grove. They're going to visit the Tower of High Sorcery. So they walk through the mists, and all of a sudden they appear on a larger roadway, a valley of sorts that's just shrouded in dark mist that just flows across the ground, and before them are these massive stone doors that are cracked and crumbling, and to either side are these old desiccated statues that were once elegant and ornate and are now falling into disrepair. Players don't know where they are, but congratulations, they're now walking into the outskirts of Barovia. And you can keep that facade up until they really journey further into Strahd's domain, or if you want to keep it Dragonlance flavored, Lord Soth's. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with that. You can have them walk into this horrific place, not know where they came out, and end up that they're playing, in Ravenloft. they had no idea. And it keeps them on their toes because they may be kind of wondering, like, where do we go? Is this another thing of the Cursed Grove? Is something going on here that we don't know? Does it really work this way? And you can start seeing those questions, and as they start running into more people and see that the place is much, much larger than they thought it would be, the questions in their mind start popping up, and they'll start looking for things. And if you start tempering the way certain spells work, especially clerical spells like communing with their god, have it be, shrouded in mystery. The god's not even quite sure what happened. You can do these things to keep them on their toes and keep them wondering what's going on. And it can come to a point where when they finally do realize what happened, they're like, oh my god, how did we miss this? There's this fun little moment of revelation around the table as everybody figures out what actually happened. And now it's like, now we need to get back home. So it can be a lot of fun to do this type of thing. Now, if you're going for game systems that nobody's played and you want to try something new, but you know the setting, you don't even have to tell them what the game is, what the setting is. You can give them the basics, the gist of things that are going on. You can give them a character sheet and tell them how the mechanics work, but don't let them know what game you're playing until they start getting into it. Now, of course, you got to make sure it's a game that your players like playing, but it can be a lot of fun. Last but not least, we have a really fun thing I think is not necessarily, I would call it experimental storytelling, but definitely adds a new twist to the table. And that is turning the narrative back on your players. Now, what I mean by that is not doing anything against the players, but making them part of the narrative process, including them in how things are described and what's actually happening. This is a trick I picked up by watching DMs, and I honestly can't remember where I first saw it, but I just immediately knew, like, this is brilliant and I want to play with this. Basically what it is if you're playing a game that has critical fails, botches, and critical hits or critical successes, this is an awesome, fun thing to do, and it can get your players more involved in the narrative and the give and take of storytelling and playing in a game. And what you do is, if a character has a critical failure, give them a moment. Usually people are waiting for you to tell them what happens. But give it just that second and pause, and then go, so what happens to your character when they fail? Describe the critical failure to me. Likewise, if they have a critical success, do the same thing. What did your character do with a critical success? Describe it to me, what happens. And it gets the players involved in the narrative. It lets them kind of think about what would happen here. Okay, here's what happens. Now, of course, you may get some players at the table who are a little more into the mechanics and a little more into beating stuff up and might just go, oh, a critical failure in combat. I stumble and drop my weapon, which is one of the most impactless things that can occur in combat. You drop your weapon, okay, so you spend a part of your turn next round picking it back up. You're disarmed. Or, you jam it. These are the typical things that we see. A weapon gets jammed, a weapon gets dropped. But if you have them kind of like encouraging their own narrative, you might have some fun responses that you can play with as a storyteller. And it can make the game a lot more give and take between you and the players, which ultimately, to be honest, is what it's supposed to be. You're in this together, why don't you make every part of it something you're in together, including narrating our failures. But that's all we have for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys try some of these little things out of your table. And if you do, please tell me how they went. Leave a comment or hate mail. If like my table hated this and it was the worst thing ever, yeah, I get that. I understand it can happen, but definitely let me know how it goes. But as always, until next time, have fun.